Hello, everyone, and welcome to FO Live with me, Claire Price, to discuss the new global agreements resulting from COP26, the Glasgow Climate Pact. The pact aims to reduce the worst impacts of climate change. Countries have come up with a plan to reduce the use of coal that's responsible for 40% of annual carbon dioxide emissions. Countries also agreed to cut fossil fuel subsidies, and there was a separate agreement between China and the US. Businesses pledged to cut out carbon emissions, and some believe they might actually drive more progress than governments. Yet many believe that COP26 didn't go far enough. The planet is heating up, extreme weather is increasing, and a full-blown climate crisis has arrived. So to distill the noise and make sense of COP26, we're joined by our panelists from all corners of the world and all different time zones as well. First up, Alicia Rambucca Wonga, who's an ocean conservationist from Fiji. Arek Sinanian, a climate change expert from Australia, and Sunil Parekh, who's a business leader from India, who's deeply engaged with sustainability issues. FO Live is brought to you by Fair Observer, a platform for citizen journalism, which has 2,500 contributors from over 90 different countries. And we would love you to join our conversation. So do sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our channel, and follow us on social media. And of course, you can publish with us also. Alisi, if I can start with you. I notice you're on mute, so I can just ask you to unmute yourself there. So obviously for Fiji and other small island nations, tackling climate change is a matter of life or death. Did COP26 deliver?
Hello, everyone. Oh gosh, just like these conferences, the answer isn't easy either. I think honestly, the answer is no, it did not. But there were silver linings there that, we look to that can help us to continue to figure out how to move forward with COP27 and work through the next 12 months, and also to continue to keep countries to account, for what they've committed to.
What was the disappointment for you that you mentioned?
There was quite a few things. It's still an ongoing discussion amongst colleagues and those that we work with in climate activism around, the watered down language on the phase out of fossil fuels and coal, on loss and damage and financing the mechanisms, on, the $100 billion commitment and how that has come through or not come through for countries around adaptation, and even for oceans. Oceans is still on the agenda, but it's still something that's not really, it's still being discussed, but not on the agenda for UNFCCC. So those were some of the things, just to touch lightly on it to start off.
Okay, perhaps Arek, if I can go to you. You wrote for Fair Observer recently that if the previous 25 COP summits have taught us anything, it's that the promises and pledges have missed the mark. The best that COP26 was able to deliver was a phasing down, not out, of fossil fuels, as Alisi's mentioned. Was it all very negative, or were there some silver linings for you?
Well, in fact, if I may be slightly positive to start with, there are always silver linings. There are always progress being made. Each COP has delivered quite a few initiatives, and of course the promises and the targets, and we yes, we are heading in the right direction, but many will argue that we are not moving fast enough. And I guess what Alisi is saying, and what many people are saying, is that the promises are not enough and the delivery is not enough, but there's always progress being made. For example, I mean, in this COP, more than 100 countries have promised to end and reverse deforestation. I mean, that's huge. It is a big commitment, 100 countries, and we know how bad deforestation has been over the last decade or two. So, I mean, okay, that is progress, yes, but I agree entirely with Alisi. just not enough. Not enough because all the promises, even if they are, all the pledges and promises that have been made, even if they are actually acted upon, and even if they are delivered, it is doubtful whether we're going to reach the 1.5 degree rise in temperatures. So I guess that's my disappointment, that we are still talking and we're not quite delivering the level that is required.
I suppose for many people, as well as the deforestation agreement, it was the climate finance initiative that's been seen as a positive step. Arek, back to you if I can just for a minute. What's your assessment of that? Is it as important as it's been hyped up to be?
Well, you mean the money aspect? Of course. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, it all boils down to money. Fortunately, in this COP, significant, I think finally the world leaders have recognized that adaptation is now going to be the big issue, because we now are heading to 1.5 plus degree increase, and this is going to have devastating impact on countries like Fiji and many other Pacific Island countries, but also some other countries, Sri Lanka, etc. Low-lying countries, sea level rise, storm surge, etc. So again, a big sort of positive note in this case was that significant amounts of money were being dedicated, or additional money have been dedicated to adaptation and in assisting very vulnerable countries, including Fiji. But again, is it enough? I, on my personal point of view, is that it is not enough. Okay. Will not be enough. I think many countries are going to be struggling for the next decade or two.
Okay, Sunil, if I can come to you next. Obviously, we've mentioned it in passing. I know that you don't represent the Indian government particularly, but clearly at the end, the agreement, the commitments were watered down because of the stand that Modi took. So rather than, it was talking about phasing out fossil fuels rather than getting rid of those completely. So why did India, which is obviously the world's third largest polluter, take that stand? Are you able to explain that?
If I could spend a minute on why I am optimistic about this COP to begin with, and I'll come back to your question a little later if you allow me to. I think it's important that I feel Glasgow has been, it was hyped to such an extent following the pandemic that people expected unrealistically that, everything will just fall into place within one negotiation of 15 days. What has taken 25 years to actually bring it to this level. So I think it was a case of unrealistic expectations to a large extent. Otherwise, what we have actually been able to achieve is that we have changed the direction, the trajectory from going up from 2.8% degree centigrade down to 2.4% if all the pledges have been made. And I think that reversal of change of the entire country, about 193 countries, finally sat and hatched out a document in 15 days was, and there has to be compromises in this because there is common and differentiated rights as it exists in the system. And those who are polluted have a bigger responsibility to handle, and they have defaulted on this. The promise of money, the promise of technology, and none of them have even actually reduced any carbon over the last 15 years in any meaningful way as per the commitments. And therefore, in the broader context, I think the fact that I feel it is a success is, number one, is that instead of a 5-year review to the NDCs that were, pledged earlier, now it is going to be an annual review. And therefore, in Sharm el-Sheikh, we don't have to wait for 5 years, by which time a lot of damage is done. There will be a review, and I'm sure there will be more commitments, because as countries experience themselves some of the problems of climate change, they do realize that they can't act upon it in isolation. The second reason I'm very happy about this COP is that there were so many standards for declaration for all your environmental norms. There was TCFD, there was SASB, there is GRI, and so many standards. Now today, IFR has now taken it upon itself to set up an international Standard for Sustainability Board, ISSB, that is going to set one set of rules, and this is going to help investors across the world to invest without actually having to fear the integrity of the data. The third area is that fossil fuel has actually made it to the document itself, which was never the case earlier. The fourth is, and this is a big one in the room because it's a short-term gain, it's a low-hanging fruit, is methane. The cutting down of methane is a very, very big effort that this Glasgow has achieved. And I agree with Arek, the forest deforestation to cease by 2030 is again a very big area when you look at the amount of hectares that is involved. And then there were three other areas which I think are very good. The one is the mitigation and the adaptation is on the table. $153 trillion worth of assets under management are now pledged to grow green. We have never had this in the 25 years of negotiations, which is what we have on the table today, with 1,800 large multinational companies across the world agreeing to sign up for this, along with rating agencies, along with the reserve central banks of various governments and the stock exchanges. So into my mind, I think this has been a major change. It's a first step in the right direction. And I think pace will accelerate the moment we go next year when they start enjoying, because everyone wants to not be the first one to start doing it. Now coming to the watering down of, the whole issue about carbon, whether do you want to phase out or do you want to phase down? So let me begin with a little bit of statistics about India. And I think that every country has its own story, and that's why it is enshrined in the agreement. There has to be, differentiated rights, even though the goal is common. India has 1.3 billion people out of 7 billion people in the world, which is 18% of world's population, and has a GDP of $3 trillion, which is expected to go to 7 trillion by 2030. Today, India is emitting 2.5 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere, as against 6 billion tons from USA and 11 billion tons from China. So even though India is a third, it's a very small third.
Yeah.
Almost 50% of the entire emissions is coming from the first two countries, that is China and, in USA. The third thing is the per capita emission is less than 2 tons in India, as compared to the world average of 4 tons per capita. And if you take US or China or Saudi Arabia, they are in excess of 17 tons per capita per year. So therefore, even though the actual consumption of carbon credits or the carbon budget is very low in India per capita basis, is the numbers that matter. And here the issue of climate justice comes. 40% of our households are without electricity. They are using biomass. They are using forest products. Now they have to have the kind of products that are available today. So either it is coal or it is wood. And this is what is driving it. Now this entire transition, if it has to have an element of justice for all those who are left behind, then
Okay.
that is the reason why, I'm sorry, I'll just take 10 seconds. I know I've crossed my time limit. But this is the reason why, this is the thinking that India took, that we are committed to 2070, but we will take a pathway which is more akin to make sure that it works for all.
All right. Thank you so much, Sunil. Thank you.
Sorry.
I know that you packed an awful lot of information into both of your answers, so a lot to unpick there. I saw that Arek has raised his hand, so do go ahead.
Yes, look, I'm sorry, Sunil, that you felt the need to defend India's position. No, but the thing is that the biggest elephant, there are many elephants in the room with COPs, but for me, the biggest elephant has always been, from the first COP to this last one, is the inequity of all of this. And I think you called it, Sunil, the injustice, if you like, climate injustice. And I think I agree with you entirely about the per capita emissions. And I know that even China, believe it or not, even China has a relatively low per capita emissions. I know they emit a huge amount, mainly because they manufacture a lot of the goods that the West, the developed world. But the elephant that I'm referring to is how, I mean, this has been the diabolical problem of humanity. So we've got high emitters per capita and in total, and we've got the developing world that's still trying to catch up. And what needs to happen, and this is a very simplistic view of it, I agree. What needs to happen, and from day one it needed to happen, is that the developed world had to lower its per capita and total emissions to allow the developing world to, in a way, catch up, not to the same level as they were before, but at least to catch up, so that at least, I mean, I'm sure Sunil has statistics on this, to have, for instance, electricity, power to most households in India, to most households in the developing world, to most households in South America, in Southeast Asia, etc. So how can this developing world catch up on being developed and having a quality of life that the developed world has enjoyed for 2 centuries? How can that happen? So a huge sacrifice, I'll call it sacrifice, but call it what you like. But adjustments, maybe a better word, adjustments have to be made by the developed world and allow, not prevent, but allow the developing world to catch up. And that's been the biggest elephant, and it hasn't gone away. And I guess that's the difficulty of climate policy. But I agree, Sunil, we are getting there. We are, as I said that at the beginning. And by the way, I'm not talking here for any country or any region or any, I'm just looking at the world and this huge problem that we have for generations to come. And it's not easy. No one assumes that it was ever going to be easy. But I guess our disappointment is, or some of the disappointment. Look, by the way, the methane that Sunil talked about, 91 countries have agreed to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. That's huge. It's fantastic. Yes. Look, I could go on. I've got a whole list of things I can tell you, all the positives. The other problem with the reporting of COPs is that we tend to hear the big item, big headlines, and the 1.5, 2.4, etc. degree. We hear about that, but we don't hear the lesser achievements that are being negotiated in the other rooms. If you've been to any of these COP meetings, there are simultaneous events and negotiations happening all over the place. So I think the general public is not aware that huge amount is being done, and it is difficult. It's 200 countries agreeing on basically achieving one goal. It's huge. Anyway, I could go on and on. So
no,
yeah.
I'm sure everyone has so much that there is, they could say about this. Alisi, if I can bring you in, I was reading that only 3 Pacific Island leaders were present in Glasgow for the summit, compared to about 500 fossil fuel industry representatives. Talking of injustice, what's putting words in your mouth here, but what's your take on all that?
Yeah, it was a real David and Goliath event. I think the ratio was 1:11 or 1:12 for every Pacific Islander who was there versus the lobbyists from the other side. And yeah, it's insane that, it's insane, and it makes sense that they would be there to protect the financial interests. And then that's another elephant in the room right there. Talking about investments and interest and money and finance, for countries versus the existence of our countries in the next 20, 50 years. And, not just to exist, but to actually be livable and functional. Fiji, in the last 5 years, we've had 2 Category 5 cyclones. And we have, had other multiple cyclones that have come through, very destructive. It's not only damaged homes, it's damaged agriculture, it has even damaged reefs, marine ecosystems where people would go and fish. And, while most other countries have the luxury of having these discussions and thinking of how important this decade is, or how much more ambition we should have in the Pacific Island countries, in atoll nations, low-lying island nations, coastal areas of the larger nations. That's a conversation that's happening right now, being continuously flooded, cyclones that are damaging, rebuilding and having destruction happen over and over again, you know, while these decisions are being made. And so like it's always multiple fronts of conversation for Pacific Islanders when you come into the room. It is an emotional conversation. And yeah, it's very difficult. We're small countries, small population, and we're facing multiple obstacles in these discussions. But, you know, like Arek and Sunil have mentioned, there have been positives. And I think for us as well, like for the Pacific Climate Warriors and 350 Pacific, it's climate activism grassroots movement that I've been part of for over a decade now. And for the last decade, that's one of the things we've been pushing for, is say no to fossil fuels and keep it in the ground. You know, that's like one of the slogans we'd always use. And finally, this year, it made it into the text. And so for us, it was also like, yes, they're finally listening. Took a little over 10 years. So for next year, what are all the tricks we can do to make sure that it takes a shorter amount of time for the message to go from outside to inside the room, to then initiate the changes that we need to make. Yeah, so that's how how we try and see the situation.
Okay, thank you, Alisi. A slightly more, well, very positive interpretation of what happened at COP26 was written up in Britain's Telegraph. I don't know if you're familiar with that paper. There's a commentator called Ambrose Evans Pritchard, and he wrote, it's irrelevant, he said, whether the climate pact said phase out or phase down, he said, because global markets will no longer fund new coal. He said that it's basically becoming uninsurable, and big money, he says, has gone from the careless enabler of fossil pollution to becoming the arch enforcer of the green order. Now, that's, you know, they're quite big words. I'm not sure if you would agree with those, Alisi. Perhaps big money is slightly divided, but I wonder if any of you have a take on that, whether you think that that's true, that the markets are just heading in the right direction now.
Can I just my point of view on this, and it's a personal one, is that there's a few moving parts here. It's not just about fossil fuel, but what's happening in the renewable energy sector. In many ways, the renewable energy sector is overtaking. I mean, speaking of investment, in many regions, I won't mention countries because there's many of them, renewable energy is really taking off, and in a way that again, it's a balancing act where it may well take over, and that's part of the problem that coal has. I mean, coal has a bad image at the moment, and if it was a brand, it would be really struggling to get followers, so to speak, on Instagram. So I think there's going to be further uptake in the marketplace for renewables, and by doing that, it will replace coal and other fossil fuels. But the sad thing is, I mean, we have the technology to solve a lot of these technical problems today. However, the reality is fossil fuels are so embedded in our lifestyle, everything from cars to airplanes to power generation, etc. But it's going to be slow, but I think it's moving in the right direction. And it's not just about what I'm trying to say is, it's not just about coal having a bad day. It's also the fact that renewables are taking over in many areas.
Okay, Sunil, can I go to you with the situation in India? Because currently, I think India relies on coal for 70% of its energy needs. Is there a shift now towards renewables? Is it happening fast enough?
Let me share. Today, India has about 362 gigawatts of installed capacity. And as we grow into the future by 2030, we expect that this total amount of energy that is required to fuel the economy will be in the region of 820 gigawatts. So it's a little more than doubling of what it is, from $3 trillion to $7 trillion. Now, the composition today is it's about 70% coal, as you mentioned. The hydro is about 12%, and the other renewables, that is solar and wind, is already 22%. So if you take hydro and renewable together, then it is close to about 45%. And then the other things are nuclear and miscellaneous. Now, the projection of the national commitments take the 820 megawatts into an increase of coal and oil and gas-fired power plants from 228 gigawatts to 282. So there is an increase of about 60 gigawatts on carbon between 2020 to 2030. But if you look at the increase in renewable, which is just 80 gigawatts now, it is going to 500 gigawatts. And therefore, the overall balance will be that out of 800, almost 55% of the entire country will be on renewables. And the dependence on coal as well as on petroleum and oil and gas is going to be substantially at just about 30-35%, thereby reducing the emission intensity of the GDP as we go forward. So that's the game plan. India doesn't have petroleum oil. It imports everything, unlike the Middle East and many other countries. And it has got lots of large reserves of coal. So there are technologies that people are looking at in terms of actually gasifying coal and making it a clean fuel and then supplying it. There is hydrogen that is likely to be developed towards the end of the decade at prices close to $1 per ton. And if that happens, it is possible that even our current combustion engine cars can run on hydrogen, which is then converted into regular fuels for combustion as well. So, there is a lot of innovation, there is a lot of technology and a lot of research that is going on simultaneously. And therefore, developing countries will probably have a little bit more time in order to look at what is available at affordable prices to make this transition more equitable and just as we grow into 2025 and beyond. And I'm personally very hopeful that even though the commitment is for 2070, when a country actually starts having lots of issues around its own problems of climate change, then the entire speed then actually accelerates. And then there is nobody arguing against it because they all know someone who's actually suffered because of it, exactly the way we experienced during the pandemic. And therefore, the momentum of the vaccine hesitators in India has now completely vanished. Everybody is being vaccinated at a phenomenal speed. I think the same will happen with climate change, whether we negotiate it or not. I think the events will overtake the policy making. That's my belief. And in a way, a fond hope, even though it's not a nice way, to build in advance and plan properly.
Sunil, you're a business leader. Can I just ask, what's the feeling among businessmen such as yourself in India? Are they pushing for net zero commitments, or are they reluctant to make those commitments because obviously it incurs more cost?
We have all kinds of people. We have about 50 large corporates, which are all multinational companies from India, including the Tata Group, the Mahindras Group, the Reliance Group, and the Ambani's Group. So these are very large corporates. They've all taken a net zero commitment by 2050. In addition to that, the top 1,000 companies have been mandated to now, by law of the stock exchange, to actually declare by March this year their total ESG footprint in their public documentation, and there is a penalty if you don't do it. By next year onwards, they are going to then ask for a systematic plan to actually reduce the environmental footprint and improvement on social and governance as well. So ESG, which was like a good thing to do for the good people, is a tick mark and compliance requirement, is now going to be absolutely mandatory. And this 1,000 company list is going to be extended to 6,000 companies, all those who are listed on the top stock exchange. And Claire, the other thing that happens is when a large company signs up for this, then under scope 3, all the vendors who supply, all the customers who use their products, everybody is part of that chain. So I think in about 5 to 7 years from now, we will see the entire industrial belt, including the 5 sectors which are difficult to mitigate, which is the steel and the cement and the aviation, and some of these other very difficult, are all going to fall into place either with hydrogen as a technology or much more efficient, even if they have to continue to use fossil fuels. So I think the change is palpable. Every boardroom is full of it. Even small companies who are vendors are now gearing up because they feel they will lose their orders if they don't actually show signs of correcting their past behavior. And I think it's happening in India on a very large scale. Right? The momentum will further pick up, but the message is on the wall.
Okay. Arek, do you agree with that, that basically events are overtaking policy, as Sunil said, you know, business is sort of forging ahead and that's what's going to make the difference?
Yeah, it's funny because, well, not funny, but it's remarkable that the market actually has overtaken policy, if you know what I mean. It's almost like the market has spoken, and that's what I was trying to say about renewables. But generally speaking, the financial markets, the technology advancements, they've basically overtaken government. And I'm not referring to any particular government, all governments, they've basically overtaken it. It's almost like, you know, there's two trains, the policy train and the technology and finance and trains, and the market train. The finance and the markets train has overtaken, and then the other one is sort of catching up. And that's fine. And I think that's fine. I think a lot of economists would argue, and I'm not one, I'm an engineer, but economists would argue, and that's because they would say that that's exactly what should happen. The market should speak, so to speak, or should shout, or should scream. But for climate change, what's been difficult, and again another elephant, is that if we left it entirely for the markets to speak, so to speak, it wouldn't be fast enough, and that's the problem. We have to make these commitments and pledges in COPs, and apply those pledges so that we're not just relying on the economic market to come somehow catch up with all of this and make it happen. Because by the time that happens, a lot of climate change will have already taken place, and it's too late.
Okay.
So it's yeah. Sunil wants to say something.
May I?
Oh, I was going to go to Alisi, but okay, Sunil,
okay.
just a few words from you, and then I've got a question for Alisi about technology. But
yeah, I think finance, the markets are not going to help the nation, you know, island states. They have severe constraints in terms of the viability of some of their projects. And I think there is a whole group of nations, to which one Alisi belongs to, which are going to require grants and which are going to require financial supports from multilateral agencies as well as governments. Because markets where they fail, they will not be able to deliver. So that was point number one. The second point was related to the fact that even in India and other developing countries which have the ability to go to the market, they require major reforms and speed in reforms to be able to attract private capital. So for example, if someone is able to underwrite the first loss on a new wind farm, which is not so economically viable, but is very desperately needed for generating decentralized power, then government support, incentives, and policy are a must, even in countries which otherwise can raise. So the viability of the projects and, you know, the ease of getting land, the ease of putting investments, all that has to be facilitated, and it requires a lot of policy work. And therefore, in a sense, what Arek was saying is the markets have overtaken, but the markets are going to be hinged and dependent on what the policy initiatives are in terms of driving the markets. That's the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you, Sunil. Alicia, just to go back to what we were discussing about new technologies, a lot of people are putting their hope in technology to sort of solve this problem. But you've talked about in, I think in some interviews that you gave to Fair Observer about how technology can result in more mining and more extraction and can actually be quite detrimental. So can you explain a bit more about that point?
Yeah, I think I was talking about greenwashing in that part where, excuse me, you know, we start to promote green technology, but then it requires, you know, it's not so green. And I was talking about must have been electric cars and the minerals that you need in order to build and run these electric cars and everything, and it's in the ground. And that also needs to be mined up in order to create that technology to have the electric cars that run around. And so while a country may make the NDC to increase the number, reduce the number of cars that, combustion and that they're going towards electric, the process of getting into that is still problematic. Right? It's still resulting in using energy burning fossil fuels, getting all these things out of the ground to create it. And so some of those solutions aren't the type of solutions that would be helpful. But listening to Arek and Sunil today, listening to the types of technology and solutions that they're talking about, I think that is like the more positive ones to think of. I guess because for us in the Pacific, one of the big issues for us as well now is deep sea mining, And why is deep sea mining coming here? Because they're coming for the cobalt and the lithium and whatever else is in the ocean to build these technologies that is supposed to help everyone. But we continue to be on the losing end in the Pacific because we're losing our islands to sea level rise. We're getting pummeled by Category 5 cyclones, and now they're digging up the oceans, creating God knows what kind of damage to our major source of protein and food and livelihoods, the ocean. It doesn't add up for us, doesn't make sense. And so it's still not fair. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
I don't know if Arek and Sunil, if you have a point of view on this technology issue. Yes, Arek, yeah.
Well, what I'm hopeful, and I think this COP has delivered a little bit of this, is that, Sunil referred to support and money, and I'm hopeful that more and more money will be allocated to countries like Fiji and all the Pacific Island countries, for instance, to avoid the damaging aspect of development in inverted commas, and also to help them adapt and to become more resilient. I work for a company, Mott MacDonald, and I'm the resilience, sorry to advertise, but I'm the resilience, and we are doing a lot of wonderful work around the world, supporting countries like Fiji, helped by banks like the ADB, Asian Development Bank, helped by the World Bank, and a lot of the developed countries are contributing to huge amounts of support money to help this. Now, is that money going to be enough? I'm not sure, but we'll have to wait and see that there's enough of assistance, adaptation, resilience, and to protect the integrity, the livelihood, and the prosperity of these smaller countries. So, I'm like Sunil, I am hopeful that this is going to happen. Is it going to happen fast enough? Alisi will have an opinion on that.
Yes, thank you, Arek. You mentioned accessing finance. We had talked about that a bit, and I think from my end, I also have to acknowledge that most developing countries, Pacific Island countries, also lack the capacity to receive and utilize a lot of these funds that are coming through. The mechanisms, the infrastructure, or whatever else that is needed in order to do that. And that has also been part of the delays in being able to do effective adaptation work in Fiji, across most Pacific Island countries as well. So it's that capacity building and technology and finance that sort of needs to all go together. And a lot of progress has happened, I think, in the last 10 years at least, me working and seeing. But it continues to evolve, and so we also need to evolve quickly with how these processes and mechanisms work, so we're able to also access and utilize these funds. And I also agree with Sunil that it also needs to be grants, because we're just getting a lot of bonds and a lot of these other mechanisms that, you know, further down the line, maybe it's not the best. Yeah, it comes down to like equity again, like we're being given bonds versus grants, you know, what other financial mechanisms of assistance that are coming and what type of capacity do these countries have in order to do this work. And in the context of UNFCCC, I don't know what technology, to what extent technology is being discussed there, but when you come home, technology for communities is a seawall. You know, technology for them is a dock that goes out further because it can help them get their boats, you know, easier. Like that's the type of things that they would think of as technology to help their lives become better. You know, as opposed to a developed country where the technology they discuss are electric cars because it's better. Or the technology of, yeah, there's many other examples, but that's probably just the one I'll use. It's sort of like the differences in the conversations that happen in different spaces and even in different countries and different contexts.
Sunil, from your perspective in India, yes, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, well, I'll just give some more hope to Alisi, because what came out of COP and in the several side meetings was that there was a great realization that has happened after the pandemic about the interdependencies of countries and weather is one major area where everyone needs to collaborate. Now, I don't think, till this COP, till the last COP, we didn't even have US on board, and is the second largest polluter on board for signing the agreement. And therefore, I feel that, the sensitivity and this entire area of philanthropy and impact investments that are looking for making social change and, the amounts involved in transforming island states into a better place are definitely within the purview of both philanthropy as well as impact investment. If the country reaches out to the right kind of people with the right story, then I think there is ample amount of finance available today. In fact, $153 trillion is the formal sector. If you add the other two sectors to it of pension fund, I mean, it's a lot of money in philanthropy as well. US alone has $350 billion of worth of money that actually goes into philanthropy every year. So I think, and large oil companies, and there are a lot of good companies with conscience that they have operated in these island states who actually have a soft corner for all the years they have been fishing and mining and so on and so forth. I think if a good relationship is built up, then either on a bilateral basis between country to country, or as a story for the financiers to come into the place, I think a lot can be done with help from people like Matt, like Arek, who can put together a package that makes sense for the investors, and it makes the social package also make sense for the investment. Now, coming to India, this whole story of how is it likely to pan out in this area, I think there's a very good story that is piling out. In India, there are about 7 or 8 different sources of finances that are operational, and almost everybody is aligned. I'm happy to inform you that impact investments, then the World Bank, the IMF, the private sector themselves, and the foundations and the endowment funds, the private capital, the private equity and the venture capital financing, the insurance funds, the pension funds, and a variety of other sources of funds which are available for innovation for startups who are working in this area. And there are very significant leaps of innovations that are taking place. The challenge is really how to scale them up. For example, in the area of plastics, I can think of at least 14 to 15 startups from around the world who are absolutely transformative. And today Unilever and P&G actually take some of these models and drive it through their own innovation system and their networks, and they bring a huge network in place. Then these transformations are possible. I think it's possible. And therefore, I think if one really sits down with the paper and pencil and looks at the issues confronting each country and what are the challenges, and then work on solutions, then there is money. That isn't a problem. And then the structuring of the finance in such a way that either they can get green credits, and Article 6 has now also been part of the entire agreement of top point that we haven't touched upon so far. But if we can generate carbon credits for these kind of impact investors and pension funds, they would be delighted at part of their conscience as well as using the carbon credits to actually alleviate it and bring justice, social justice angle into it. So I am in fact very bullish on this. I really feel that we have the technology, as Arek says, the finance is also there. It's the structuring of the entire deal using Article 6 and various other mechanisms under the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, to actually give this whole idea a practical shape for both developing countries as well as very vulnerable countries. Thank you.
I think you might have mentioned this, Sunil, but more than 450 firms representing many of the world's largest financial players announced $130 trillion, I think you mentioned it, of private capital to be managed by the newly formed Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero.
Absolutely right. Absolutely.
$130 trillion. So look, as we keep saying, there's some plenty of good news. Yeah, but as Alisi is also saying that maybe some more good news can come our way, not in the form of electric cars. I fully understand, Alisi, but maybe I think what that also emphasizes, this is another observation about the global move, is that one solution does not necessarily, my solution does not necessarily apply to you, and the solution for one country of renewable or electric car or whatever it is does not apply to the other country. I think each country and each region maybe needs to look at its own area, which they are doing, of course they are, but I think lots of assistance is needed, which we keep repeating here.
Okay, I think we'll just have a few comments from each of you just to conclude our discussion today. So Alisi, if I can come to you, how optimistic really are you after the COP26 summit? Do you think that we're on the right track?
Well, I did have a discussion with a colleague who was part of the negotiating teams for the Pacific, and he has been part of it for a few years now. And he was quietly optimistic, and I kind of like took on that energy from him about the discussions that happened, the progress that was made, all of the same points that Sunil and Arek had made as well, around moving in the right direction, but probably not as fast as we should. And, sort of also encouraging climate activism and movement and young people who are in the space and pushing as well that, he from the inside also saw the impacts of all the movements on the street within the negotiating space and within the language that was being used or pushed. And so he also gave that. So that was sort of like an end check to as well. Okay, so within the next 12 months, we're able to maybe sort of fine tune what we're supposed to do, the messaging we're supposed to push out, and the kind of pressures that we can put on, finance institutions and all these other places to be able to go in the direction that we're hoping for. That's what I think about. Yeah, it makes me hopeful. It also reminds me it's COP27 next year, so that's going to be 27 years of discussing this. And as Arek had mentioned from the start, that's less talking, more action. So how do I also do that? Yeah, I think that's sort of my final remarks on it.
Okay, Sunil, your final remarks on COP?
I'm looking forward to going to Sharm el-Sheikh. It's a lovely place next year. But on a little more serious note, I think one of the solutions to this entire crisis is solar energy. We all know about it. And the challenge is that the battery costs are pretty high. So when you add the battery cost to the cost of solar generation, then it becomes a little expensive. And I think under the Indian Solar Alliance, which is located in Delhi, there has been a very audacious proposal that was tabled in Glasgow, and that met the approval of Mr. Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of UK. And just look at the audacity of the idea and the ability to solve the problem. One sun, one world, one grid. Now, first when I heard about it, I said, how the hell is electricity going to go over all the oceans? It's not, this is all flight in the air. But the more one thinks about it, the more I read about it, I realized that people who are on board on this is USA on the West Coast, Australia on the East Coast, France in between, and India in between. Now, the sun is always shining in one of these 4 continents throughout the entire 24 hours and 365 days a year. Now, so that's a fantastic thing. So, depending on where is day and where is night, you can get continuous electricity. If you can just tap into it, and you don't need storage then, because it is being generated on the spot. The other very interesting aspect that came out of this is that the moment you have one grid and it supplies electricity across, the technology may or may not be there, I don't know. An engineer like Arek may like to comment upon it. But if the solution that is envisaged solves all problems, then clearly I think we all need to put our heads together and work upon it. And if that happens, all our problems are solved overnight. And just 10 seconds. I was so surprised to learn, friends, that one day of what the solar energy comes into the state of Rajasthan is enough to run the country India for a year. But that is the kind of power that the solar energy has. And when I came across these statistics, I couldn't believe it, because it's mind-blowing. And we really need to make some of these big ideas happen, because there is a consensus of $150 trillion worth of impact investment that can't make any more impact than this. I'm very hopeful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Arek, your final comments, but I particularly want you to comment on whether you feel that 1.5 degrees is still possible, or if that is just completely pushed to one side now. We're now looking
I have to rely on the experts to tell me that it is still possible. Yes, it is possible. Unlikely maybe, but possible. It can be done. We can achieve it. Let's hope that we do achieve it. But if we don't achieve it, I think what COP26 has taught us is that we can move more quickly, and we have moved more quickly. And as Sunil said, because we're going to review it every year now, I think we will see faster progress. It can be argued that we did not quite move fast enough for COPs 1 to 25. Yes, we did not, unfortunately, but I think if I had to draw a curve, I'm an engineer, I'd do everything in graphs. The graph is starting to pick up, so to speak, and we're on the right trajectory. Sunil's smiling, so I feel happy about that. The trajectory is moving in the right direction, and much faster than we have ever seen before. So there is hope. Alisi, stay with us. Don't lose hope. I think we're going to get there. We may not achieve 1.5, but hey, it's we're going to get there. I think there's a lot of hope. Okay. I'm hopeful. I have to be optimistic. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all our wonderful panelists. You've been really super insightful and surprisingly optimistic, actually. So it was really nice to hear those thoughts. Just a quick plug again for Fair Observer. We're a platform for citizen journalism, which has 2,500 contributors from 90 different countries, and we would love you to join us. So do sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our channel, and follow us on social media. Thanks very much to you all. Thank you.